straight for the
It was dangerous.
I'm trying to find myself.
sitting there and
I need to find
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I'm trying to be a better.
You guys don't do like the table.
the table.
It was one of the
So awkward. Still.
I don't really need it. I'd rather stand so I could look.
Stand, you find yourself more mindful than
so I didn't.
Do we have a hard stop at 3 just so I can time it?
We don't have anything else in this room, but it's.
I have a thing at 3 that I'm not gonna go to, so we don't have a hard stop at Christmas break. So let's go to 3:50.
How is this?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
You know, as you know, tell me when you want.
Might be.
Just a quick look outside. No, there's
5 minutes.
Had a conference yesterday, so I arrived.
We're reading a Jerry Bakery. Like, careful.
To talk to you about. It's a really interesting time.
It is. Yeah.
Talking to the Bombay.
She's
My wife's
I had
talking.
breakfast with Steve this morning.
Old
So
cases.
I'm from Sri Lanka.
he just gave me the highlights.
I'll give you the low light.
You like to read those
old-timey opinions? It's hard to read, you know,
Yeah.
When we get started.
It's like just excessive style of
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. My name is Tariq Masood. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School, and it's my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Larry Diamond. So I'm kind of a visual thinker, and so when there's certain concepts I always associate with images. That's how I remember them. Like, for example, when I think about like hamburgers, for some reason I always think about Muhammad Ali, and I didn't understand why until I realized that when I was younger, I saw that Muhammad Ali had a short-lived hamburger chain. When I think about God, for example, I think about George Washington. I don't know why. I grew up in this country in the first 9 years of my life, and I guess we were taught to revere George Washington, so that's the image that pops into my head. A few years ago, former colleague of ours here at the Kennedy School, Scott Mainwaring, wrote a book with Anibal Perez-Lignan on the survival and breakdown of democracies in Latin America. What he argued was that the critical ingredient for democratic survival was something he called the normative commitment to democracy. This is when political leaders believed so deeply in democracy that they were willing to stick by democracy even when it didn't deliver the policy outcomes they wanted. So whenever I think of normative commitment to democracy, I think of Professor Larry Diamond. Professor Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and Robert Mosbacher fellow, senior fellow in global democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. He is also you should think about Larry when you think about normative commitment to democracy. You should also think about Larry when you think about Stanford. I think he's got all his degrees from Stanford. He takes all of his meals at Stanford, only talks to people from Stanford. Larry is one of the world's greatest scholars of democracy. Everything that he has written about democratic transition and survival is seminal in our field. And in addition to being a great scholar, he's a great producer of public goods, one of which is the Journal of Democracy, now a 34-year-old journal that is published out of the National Endowment for Democracy that Larry edited for 30 years. And then in a stunning testimony to the decay of American institutions, I succeeded him. So Larry is one of the activities of the Journal of Democracy is the annual Lipset Lecture, which is a lecture that is delivered by a great scholar of or a great practitioner in the world of getting and keeping democracy. And this year's Lipset Lecture was delivered by Larry. We're soon to publish it in the Journal of Democracy, and these remarks are based on it. So Larry, welcome to Harvard. Please join me in welcoming the normative commitment to democracy.
So as I say to my students at Stanford, one of the penalties you pay for being late is you have to sit at the front of the class. Well, thank you, Tarek, for giving me probably the most entertaining introduction. I wish everything you said about me was true, except for the line about taking all my meals at Stanford, in case you have been there recently and know what's on offer. But in any case, it's a pleasure to be with you. So let me explain to you what this is, and then I'll go through as much of it as I can, while leaving enough time for Q&A. I was invited to give the 20th annual Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture on Democracy in December, which is an annual lecture sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy. That's given in Washington at the Canadian Embassy and in Toronto at the Monk Center at the University of Toronto. And it was very meaningful for me because Marty Lipset was my thesis advisor. But you know, the Washington audience, they're not interested in PowerPoint slides. So this is what I inflicted on the audience at the University of Toronto, and what I'm going to inflict on you. And if you want a narrative version with a different kind of twist, because I'm afraid the normative bias will bleed in a lot more into that written version. That will be in the April issue of the Journal of Democracy. Thank you, Mr. Co-editor, for publishing it. And so let's get started. I have 4 summary observations I want to make about the state of democracy in the world. They haven't changed very much over the years, and that may be a sign of the fact that I'm not very imaginative, or I'm not being adequately responsive to the way the world is changing, or it may be that I'm correct in saying we have been and remain in a long, protracted, and quite serious, I think in some ways increasingly serious, global democratic recession, which I suggest you'll see why when you see my evidence, began around 2007. Now, you know, Steve Levitsky is my former student. He's one of the former students of mine I'm most proud of. So it's interesting that he and one of my hosts at the University of Toronto, Luke and Wei, the 3 of us have been in a bit of a friendly debate for a few years about how to interpret this complex reality of global resilience, if you will, their word, and global change. And so that involves the next 2 points. I actually think, despite how long this has been, and despite how serious this has been, this does not yet rise and may never rise to the level of what Huntington called a reverse wave of democratic breakdowns. It's in net terms, doesn't seem to me to be quite decisive enough for that. I'll let you see the data and make your own judgment. And it is true, as Steve Levitsky and Luke and Wei wrote in the Journal of Democracy, I think last year, we have to acknowledge, we should take some heart in acknowledging that there's been a fair amount of democratic resilience as well. I just saw Steve earlier today. I asked him about Argentina, which is one of the countries in the world, one of the many, obviously particularly in Latin America, on which he has considerable expertise. And I said, so Javier Milei, what's it looking like? And, you know, what could be said about Argentine democracy, I'll let Steve speak for himself, is that they survived Menem. And, you know, the democracy may well be, probably is, resilient enough, institutionally rooted enough in Argentina. So even someone who I think has worrisomely, you know, illiberal and potentially authoritarian tendencies is hopefully not going to mess with the basic parameters of democracy. The biggest challenge to resilience, I'm just going to say it, you want me to come back to it later, I'm happy to do so, but it's not going to be the subject of this lecture, is the United States. And I think whether the United States, this is awkward to say in a university setting, 501c3 and all of that, but I offered as an analytic judgment, as a general statement, without attached to any particular personality, that if the United States were to elect someone who is clearly previously demonstrated and rhetorically and by planning signaled authoritarian intent, there's nothing that could happen in the world to democracy in the coming years that would be more worrisome for the future of democracy globally than that. And that would, I think, be a pretty serious challenge to the argument about democratic resilience. And then the fourth thing is kind of where I wind up, and it's not unrelated to what I just said, that we remain in a volatile and uncertain period. I think we're going to look back on this 50 years from now and say, this was really a contested period in global history. So key trends, this is how I would summarize the global empirical evidence, is that global levels of freedom and democracy have been declining. You'll see the data, you can make your own judgment. The declines in the rule of law and what Guillermo O'Donnell called horizontal accountability are a crucial element of that. Illiberal populism is still spreading and still arising anew in various places. I'm just back from Taiwan from the quite successful democratic election there. There was a third-party candidate who I don't think is seriously illiberal, but I think manifests many of the features of populism and raises some concerns in my mind. And if one of the healthiest third-wave democracies can be experiencing that, in the social media era, populism has legs. The fourth trend, and with globalization dramatically increasing inequality, I have so much more I could say about this than I'm going to have time to, and I'll just plant the flag on AI right now, that if you think we have a problem now of increasing inequality, economic and social inequality, and marginalization, and if not unemployment, underemployment, I think it is even a fraction of what we're going to experience with the AI revolution. Then the fifth thing is that, again, back to social media and the digital revolution, we're seeing diffuse trends of polarization and intolerance. I personally think the only two things, and really the main thing, that could explain why we're seeing it almost universally around the world in democracies is because of the way in which social media facilitates and supercharges it. But again, globalization is feeding into it. We know about the authoritarian resurgence and power projection. There's so much more I'd like to say about Russia and China than I'm going to have the time to say here, but maybe you'll ask about it. This is the overview. Maybe I should just stop at this and then we take it. I've already talked or alluded to the decay of democratic quality in the US. It's not only with the prospect of an authoritarian presidency, but when you have a democracy where large numbers of election officials are resigning because they're getting death threats, Exhibit 1 is enough to say the democracy is under stress. And that's only the beginning of so many things we could say about the ill health of our democracy. The Democracy Fund in Washington, D.C., which has been doing the voter study groups, either is about to release or has just released a study about the hypocrisy of many Americans, the very contingent nature of their commitment to democracy. I really urge you to have a careful look at that. And that leads to the seventh point, that there remain, and there is in the back of this presentation, you want to make the slides available, Tarek, you're free to do so, a whole lot of public opinion survey data that I'm not going to have the time to present in any detail. I will just summarize it by saying that I think democracy is still a universal value in the sense that Amartya Sen used the term, that it is a system and a normative aspiration that people everywhere in the world see of relevance and value to their lives. So it's universally relevant. It doesn't mean it's universally equally committed to everywhere in the world, but there's still quite resilient support for it in a lot of places, most surprisingly, perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa, which is, again, perhaps surprisingly, the region of the world that I think has the best regular, widely applied barometer of public opinion on democracy, the Afrobarometer. But there is declining trust and satisfaction with democracy in many parts of the world, and pretty alarming declines in Latin America and in individual countries like South Africa. And then finally, we came out of an era in the 1980s and particularly 1990s where there were so many high-profile, successful movements for democracy that led to transitions to democracy. And we are now in an era, I documented this in an article in the Journal of Democratization a few years ago, where almost every single high-profile movement for democracy in the last 20 years has failed. So these are the global trends, and this slide is here because I could go on a very long riff about the minimum definition of electoral democracy. I don't have the time to do that now. I don't think I need to do it for this audience. I just want to say, I think I'm taking not a pure Schumpeterian, but a pretty minimalist definition that in the slides you're going to see, I will make two distinctions. Number one, what are the countries that are able to choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections? And then we'll look at the subset of those that meet a test of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy for me is easier to measure because I'm just taking a measure from Freedom House, the countries that get either a 1 or a 2, one of the 7 best scores on political rights and also on civil liberties. So it has to be both. It's a little bit more demanding than the countries they label free. And those I call liberal democracy. And electoral democracies, I consult many measures, but I've got my own data set, happy to make it available to you, of the countries that meet a minimum test of electoral democracy. And this is, on the margins, a really tough judgment in some places. Now, let me say, it's not a tough judgment in Hungary. And the reason why there's a whole paragraph in my Journal of Democracy article forthcoming that makes that point is because there's one of the most prominent annual democracy ratings efforts that keeps, utterly mysteriously to me, and it's not out of any moral compromise, classifying this country as an electoral democracy. But it tells you how hard the judgments can be on the margin, particularly when you get an autocrat as clever as Orban. And I actually think there is no autocrat in the world who is more skillful and clever than Viktor Orban. So anyway, those are the boundaries, and then this is the data. So the blue line here on this slide is for electoral democracy, or the bars, and then the orange is for liberal democracy. you know, the states of Western Europe, the Anglophone states, they're all liberal democracies, although the U.S. is testing the proposition, the Pacific Island states, Central and Eastern Europe, most of it's democracy, about 60% liberal democracies, as I've defined it. These are the countries of Latin America and Caribbean that have populations over 1 million. The countries of East, Southeast, and South Asia, only now 32% democratic. Sub-Saharan Africa, democracy, liberal democracy, and then the former Soviet Union and the Middle East and North Africa. Now, let me say as well, this is the snapshot at the end of 2022, as I've judged it. We're getting new data coming out in the next week, too, from Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit, Democracy Index, the varieties of Democracy Index. These are, I'd say, the three big ones. There are a couple others. One of the things I've done, because they each have their idiosyncrasies, is standardize all these annual ratings on a 0 to 100 scale. And then average them. For me, if I have to go to a single measure, that average is the single measure I find most useful. This is a portrait of change in the extent of electoral democracy and the extent of liberal democracy between the end of 2006, which was, I think, the last year before the democratic recession really began to take hold, and the end of 2022. And you can see that with the exception of these tiny Pacific Island states, electoral and again, the Western Europe and the Anglophone states, on electoral democracy, you've had significant decline in most of the regions. In sub-Saharan Africa, from 43% of the 49 states in sub-Saharan Africa being electoral democracies to 27%. And this is the more slight change in liberal democracy. Now, we've got two slides that aggregate all of this and give you a picture of, what's the extent of change over the whole arc of the third wave of global democracy between 1974 with the peak around 2006, and then the decline. In electoral democracy, the blue line, and then the smaller percentage of states that meet the test of liberal democracy. And my principal point about this slide is this is not the slide you should focus on. And the reason why is it includes all 195 countries in the world. And what I have discovered, I discovered this many years ago, it keeps being the case, it's just ever more dramatically true, is that there is a dramatic difference between the percentage of democracies and liberal democracies among the slightly more than 40 states with populations under 1 million people and the percentages in countries over 1 million people. And if you look only at all states, you see a recession here from about 61, 62% of the states being democratic to 53%, but it doesn't look very serious. If you look at the states only over 1 million population, it looks a lot more serious. Now, in order to brace you, and you can see the numbers, I don't need to repeat them, in order to brace you for the shock of the next slide, I need to say the following. Two of the judgments I have agonized about the most are India and Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, is going to be holding its presidential election very soon this month. India, probably in May. And, if you're looking at how many people live in democracies, these are pretty consequential decisions. Freedom House, I think last year, downgraded Indonesia to the status of non-democracy. It has not done so for India. There's never been an instance since I started doing this coding where Freedom House coded as a non-democracy a country that I thought was a democracy. The difference has always been in the other direction. So it was a difficult decision. I did some reading. I kind of downgraded Indonesia to the status of a non-democracy. I'm really not sure about that, actually, and I think I might have made a mistake. But when, for the purpose of this slide, and in particular the next slide, and the book that Shumika Anguli, Dinsha Mistry, and I are about to bring out as an edited volume with the University of Michigan Press in a few months on the troubled state of India's democracy, I came to the conclusion that we can no longer call India an electoral democracy. I'm actually much more willing to defend that decision. And I'll be happy to defend it here at some considerable length if you'd like me to. I think if you look at the trajectory of what, forget about Orban, because it isn't even close to as subtle as what Orban has done in Hungary. I think the better analogy is to Turkey. I think it's on that trajectory. And when you look at the abuse of power, the concentration of power, the bullying and prejudice against India's very large Muslim minority, and the intimidation of the universities, the press, civil society, the business community, it's on its way to being, and I think, in fact, has crossed the line into becoming a competitive authoritarian regime. And one test of that is, I can tell you with some information I won't share, if you say that in international forums or in certainly in India, you will be targeted. Okay, so if you judge that India and Indonesia, and of course the most decisive decision here for the purpose of this slide is India, that we can no longer put them in the category of electoral democracy, then the percent of people living in democracy has declined from the peak of about 55% in the early 2000s to 25% today. And of course, if you add Indonesia back into the ranks of electoral democracies, it comes up a few percentage points, but it's still under 30% because India is about 18% of world population. So now I'll go through these very quickly so you'll understand why I say we're in a deep and persistent and troubling democratic recession. If you take a snapshot of each decade, obviously this is only 9 years, all the others are 10 years. So 49 years of the third wave, and one of the beauties of being in 2024 is when we get the data for last year, we'll have 50 years and a very nice slice of time. But the rate of democratic breakdown was rather high in the first tentative decade of the third wave. We didn't even know we were in a wave of democratization. There was about 1 out of every 6 democracies that existed in that decade broke down. And then it fell in the next 2 decades to 8%, rose to 12%, and was 19% in the last decade. And this is the failure rate, and it's pretty high, 40% for all democracies in that 49-year period. And then exactly the reverse image, the percentage of autocracies in any given decade that broke down and gave way to democracies, not that broke down and gave way to another autocracy. It peaked at 36% in the 1980s and early 90s, then declined to 30%, 21%, then 12%. Not too many democratic transitions in the last decade. And then, so we're now underwater with a net decrease in democracies, and ratio of transitions to breakdowns in the last 5 years was only 30% as many transitions as breakdowns. Most of these transitions are countries that had kind of slipped beneath the minimum standards of democracy, getting back to it, something like that. It wasn't a mass movement for democracy. And this is the famous Freedom House slide, which shows the ratio of countries gaining in freedom on their 100-point scale to the number declining. And that ratio was almost always positive in the 15 years immediately following the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. Then it fell to parity in 2005, and in 2006, in 2006 parity, and in 2007, again, the year that I think the democratic recession started, it's been, more countries declining than gaining, only about 70%, 50% or less gaining in relation to the number declining. But Freedom House found that ratio came back to about parity again last year, and now I'm waiting with bated breath to see what it'll be this year. All right, so why did the democratic recession begin around 2006? I think these are probably, familiar potential explanations to you. I think David Patel in the back of the room knows I have a little personal experience in this, that the Iraq intervention and the failure to build democracy there, the need to justify it as an exercise in democracy building when we didn't find weapons of mass destruction, it generated a backlash against democracy promotion globally. The legitimacy for it around the world, the public support for it in Europe and the United States. Then the next blow, the 2008 financial crisis. Where did that start? In the world's most powerful democracy, the United States. Then around the same time, I live in the epicenter of this in the Silicon Valley, so I've seen these companies rise. And in 2007, Facebook was this little thing in a former, middle school on the edge of the Stanford campus, and now, what it's become globally, and we could talk about, of course, what its impact has been. But I do think it's a major factor, and the technology boom more generally. I repeat this again. I used to think, we published a few articles on this in the Journal of Democracy, one by Frank Fukuyama, another by Terry Carl, and others as well. There is a literature on this that, like, inequality is not a good thing for democracy. Actually, this goes back to Aristotle, if you want to go that far back, and certainly to Dahl and so on. But now I think it has become a major driver of the problems we face, and a bewilderingly underestimated driver. Like, I'm trying to figure out why there isn't more awareness about this and passion about this, except on some parts of the political spectrum, but it ought to be kind of more of a shared concern. Okay, and then there's been a global power shift. Look, the US and Europe, they've lost relative share of GDP. China has risen, although it's in deep trouble now. Russia is at least resurgent militarily and in terms of sharp power, and so on and so forth. Now, if you're looking for a smoking gun about, whether really in or have been in or still in a democratic recession, I think this is it. I think, if I had to rest my empirical argument, it would be with these two slides. So what I did was, again, I've got this average scale of democracy, 0 to 100, that averages the Freedom House democracy index of The Economist and the varieties of democracy from what I think was the start of the democratic recession in 2007. So looking before that at the end of 2006 and the end of 2022. We can take all the countries and then say, okay, during this 16-year period, how many countries gained at least 5 points on the 100-point scale from where they finished in 2006 and where they wound up in 2022? declined by at least 5 points, and the rest we won't pay attention to. Of the democracies that gained, there were only 6. Of the democracies that declined during this period, that is, democracies that were democracies in 2006, 30 of them declined by at least 5 points, and of course, some of them ceased to be democracies. There were 12 countries that oscillated back and forth. By that, I mean, at one point, they lost at least 5 points, and then they gained at least 5 points. There were, and this is the thing a lot of people are missing, the autocracies have gotten a lot more autocratic. 30 of the countries that were autocracies in 2006 became much worse by at least 5 points, much more authoritarian during this period, and only 11 of them improved. Now, there is something else we need to look at, and that is this pink bar here. First of all, this only looks at countries over 1 million population. And the pink bar looks at the slightly over 40 states in the world that are more consequential states in the following way. They have populations over 100 million people and or GDPs nominally of over $500 billion. And what you find, this is like, if you just will print out the side, put it under your pillow, toss it overnight, you'll see why I'm so worried. Because not only do we see many more democracies declining over these 16 years than improving, but they're disproportionately pretty consequential countries in the world. Brazil, India, Indonesia, whether or not you still classify Indonesia as a democracy, the Philippines, South Africa, Thailand, and again, not least the US. And the more consequential countries meeting one of those two standards that improve were Taiwan, which really is kind of a miracle success story, and Colombia, which came back from the brink of democratic downward spiral. And again, there have been a lot of worsening autocracies among big and consequential states. So I won't even comment on these. I'll just show you Colombia has improved on the average scale of 100-point scale of democracy pretty impressively from the days of Alvaro Uribe, if I've got his first name right. And then you can see how much Mexico has declined. I mean, there's a very serious challenge to electoral democracy, not to mention its liberal elements in democracy. Brazil, obviously this was the end of 2022, so it's reflecting the Bolsonaro era. If you think things are a lot better in Brazil now, and they are better, I suggest you take a really careful look about what's happening to Transparency International in Brazil, what's happening to the Supreme Court in Brazil, and what's happening to the cancellation of efforts at accountability for corruption in Brazil now, today, under the Lula government. And here you have Argentina, which is kind of holding its own. And then this is Asia. I thought Thailand was going to return to democracy. You get this miracle election where a middle-class professional party comes out of nowhere, finishes first in the election. The principal thing that distinguishes the Move Forward Party in Thailand over all of its peer parties is its decisive, unambiguous commitment to democracy. The leader, a young, telegenic, articulate, impressive leader of this party emerges as the candidate for prime minister. It is assumed that Thaksin's Pheu party will ally with it, and then the alliance that is the ruling alliance in Thailand which is the military and other hidden elites, and another institution that if I named it, I might be accused of a certain crime in Thailand and prevented from going back there. So I will not name that institution because there's already enough countries that I'm not allowed to visit. But in any case, this is what I mean about the preemption of, democratic possibilities. Here are some countries in or on the edge of Europe. And note, by the way, I strongly think that Ukraine is a battleground test for the future of democracy in the world. But come on, a country at war is not going to be a sweet liberal democracy. And I think we should probably, we need a better, more rounded perspective of Ukraine, Zelensky, and so on and so forth. And this is South Africa, and I'm not sure the score of 69 adequately captures the deterioration of democracy in South Africa. I think it's much better captured by the collapse in public support for democracy in South Africa, and probably in the ANC's vote total later this year. And here it is, the percent of people in South Africa saying to the Afrobarometer, I don't know, about 10 or 12 years ago, that they think the country is a democracy, or democracy with only minor problems compared to a democracy with major problems, or not a democracy at all. You can see the 13-point decline here. One of the things that really worries me is that you've got only two countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have been continuously democratic since independence, Botswana and Mauritius. They're small countries, over 1 million, but not very much over 1 million population. There's been marked democratic decline in both countries. Nobody's paying attention. And this is the rate of democratic satisfaction, which has now declined in South Africa from 43% to 25%. But you see it in Mauritius and Botswana as well. I think these are kind of canaries in the coal mine, but again, we can talk about that later. These are some of the average regional trends. I want to wrap up soon, so I'm going to go through most of these slides quickly, but you can see how poorly the US is doing. This is just the Freedom House data. The average measure wouldn't be much better compared to its, advanced industrial democracy peers. This slide shows, I've taken the Freedom House data and recalculated the two scales of political rights and civil liberties into three scales: political rights, civil liberties, rule of law, including transparency and control of corruption. And what I'm trying to show here, you see it most dramatically for Africa, but you see it in other regions as well. This is always the lagging indicator: transparency and the rule of law. And if we could improve that, we could actually really improve the fate of democracy in the world. And it's also the one that has declined the most. So it just shows no matter which scale you look at, every region is declining. And this is it's not, if you just average it all out, it's not a catastrophic decline, but it's global and it's relentless. And that's what worries me most. A lot of failed democratic transitions. These are some of the examples. So let me close with a few reasons about why, and then we'll, I guess, have hopefully half an hour for Q&A. First of all, back to the normative commitment, right? It can't just be in this room or among intellectuals around the world. You need it more broadly by elites. That's been eroding. And I think there are a lot of reasons why. We could ponder them. We could have a very interesting discussion about that. But I think that when they're not facing any consequences, elites, when they think they can get away with it, and we don't really know what's in the minds and hearts of elites, and it's very hard to draw it out of them. because it's not going to be as honest as a randomly selected a sample of a population will be when they're talking to an academic interviewer. But we can judge by their behavior. And in the years from the mid to late 80s, I think, through maybe 2006, most elites in swing states or states that, were not firmly rooted or consolidated democracies that were subject to, quote, Levitsky way, linkage and leverage from the Western democracies, they weren't going to go there. They knew there were going to be consequences for them and then for their countries and then for their populations and for their survivability and their standing in the world if they tried to violate democratic norms. And, excuse me, I think one of the biggest problems we face is you get a Bukele who basically just, closes down democracy and launches an authoritarian war on the criminal gangs in El Salvador, which has made him the single most popular leader in all of Latin America. And he sees no consequences. You get an elected, now two-term president like Macky Sall, who has a constitutional obligation in Senegal to hold an election within the next few weeks. And he again postpones the election. He's probably going to cancel it altogether. And what are the consequences? And I can go on and on with examples where people do these things and there really are no consequences. So if they see others doing them and they're getting away with them and they can wind up where Orban is, or they can wind up where Erdogan is, or they can wind up now where Narendra Modi is in India, and the price to be paid for doing this is that you get to come to Washington, D.C., have a meeting with Biden in the Oval Office, then the rare honor of a state dinner and the rare honor of an address to a joint session of the Congress. Well, for many of us, that might be a disincentive, but I don't think it was for Modi. You can read these bullets here. I think we've abandoned the task in the US and elsewhere of civic education. I've already made my comments about social media. We're doing a lot of work at the National Endowment for Democracy and actually at Stanford and Hoover on authoritarian propaganda. All of this is fading, is entering in. And then we have declining accountability. The courts are weaker. Institutions of horizontal accountability are weaker. People like Modi, Erdogan, Orban, they go to work to undermine the courts and these institutions of monitoring and checks and balances, and then the way is cleared for them to pursue their authoritarian projects. I think civil society has been weakened with its efforts to pursue accountability. I've already talked about external accountability, and who knows what was in their minds and hearts, but it's either less democratic now or it always was not very democratic, but at least they had to hold their not very democratic aspirations in check. Institutions are weaker. These are all of those. Economic performance, I've already alluded to, has declined. The unemployment rate in South Africa is about 35%, at least for young people. And, anyone who's read Bob Putnam's immortal work, Making Democracy Work, knows what the downward spiral of the uncivic society looks like. And I think actually it could be a pretty useful exercise to reread that book in order to understand why democracy is deteriorating in so much of the world. And then you have this. I think I should stop and I'll take questions, comments, whatever.
Fantastic. Thank you. I just want to ask the first question. So the bottom line of this talk, democracy is not doing so well. No, I'm just kidding. So one of the things you've always impressed me with is your command of the landscape of political regimes. Is there a place that defies this grim story? Is there a positive story somewhere out there?
Yes. So thank you. There's not a positive regional story to my awareness very much, although we'll see what happens in the European Union elections. The European Union, to my perception, looks a lot better than the US now. But there are individual countries where, they've come back from the brink, and we can learn a lot from the process. And I note this in the Journal of Democracy article. So I'll mention a few. One is Colombia, and I refer you to the really excellent piece by Laura Gamboa in the Journal of Democracy a couple of years ago, a year ago, which I think is not only a good treatment of Colombia, and another case she looked at, but theoretically very important about the tactics that Democrats can use, and the importance of mobilizing, but within democratic norms and institutions, to challenge all this. And look, we'll see what happens in Israel, but Netanyahu, in my opinion, is an authoritarian populist with the goal. This leaves all the other issues around his project aside, but just looking internally at Israel, the goal of creating an authoritarian state in Israel. And he was stopped by the mobilization of civil society. I think that's very important. But the most common way that you get a more positive turn on things is through elections. And I think that the recent Polish election in October of last year that brought Donald Tusk, the former prime minister, back to power with the Democratic Civic Alliance, is an iconic historical lesson in how to turn back an authoritarian project. And another is Greece, where there was a left wing that was kind of a little bit dancing with the right wing illiberal project, and then the kind of centrist democratic alternative of Mitsotakis won the election 6 or so years ago. And I really recommend to you the article by invitation, the essay by Mitsotakis in, I think, this week's Economist magazine. There's a lot of insight there about how they turn things around.
Okay, we should open it up for questions. So, Catherine.
Yeah, hi Larry.
Good to see you.
So I'm completely persuaded. I'm completely depressed.
Well, you shouldn't be depressed. I am not depressed.
But let me ask a question. That is what you've broken down very nicely for us. What's happening with liberal democracy and electoral democracy? Okay, but you've just lumped all the authoritarians together.
Okay.
As if they're equal, and we know VDEM at least is breaking them down by closed autocracy and electoral autocracy. I think that's what they say. And the question I have is just your point about Poland and some of these others. What's clear is that the one big decline that happened and was sustained is the decline in closed autocracies. They've been replaced by electoral autocracies. And the question is this: does that possibility open more space for change? In other words, with Indonesia, with India, okay, the countries that have slid into what you're calling, you didn't say it, but electoral autocracies, does civil society, do political parties, does the country still have space for making the change back to electoral democracy?
Yes. Okay, the answer is obviously yes. And I think the easiest, most viable, and least costly path from, and most likely to succeed path from non-democracy back to democracy is through elections. I absolutely emphatically want to say that. So the more space, the better. The more aspects of democracy, the better. I'll always take whatever space, can be pried away from a regime or preserved or whatever. So I would rather have a country, even like India now, or the Philippines under Duterte, that's in the gray zone, let's say. I think they were both autocracies, Duterte then, India now, but I'd rather have a more ambiguous version of competitive authoritarianism than an obvious one. And I'd rather have a competitive authoritarian regime than a non-competitive authoritarian regime. And I'd rather have an electoral authoritarian regime than China. So that's the first thing. And, you know, there are always surprises when you have elections. And they're mobilizing, I mean, you know all of this, they're mobilizing moments. The only thing I can say, which is not only a little bit of a challenge to our beloved colleague, Erica Chenoweth, but to me as well, because I've cited all the work that she has done and the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict and so on the overwhelmingly greater likelihood of getting to democracy through nonviolent mobilization. There is one instance in the world where all that's been left to the movement for democracy is violent resistance, or at least that's what they came to the conclusion of. And there are a lot of signs they are actually winning on the battlefield, and that is in Myanmar. Now, I don't know what's going to happen, but I just wanted to flag that for everyone in the room.
Erica actually is starting to adapt her argument.
Sorry?
Erica is starting to adapt her argument.
Oh, okay.
But this, I just wanted to say, because with regard to Latin America, I think the story that is going on is something you kind of missed, and that is it used to be all closed autocracies. These were all military coups, you brought up the tanks, and massive human rights violations. Now, mainly, that's off the plate of options. That's off the option. And so we have these electoral authoritarians. We have the Bukeles. We have, and so, or even the Bolsonaros who wish to be electoral authoritarians, right? And so that is still an interesting point, right? That you can't just turn the clock back to the old days of electoral authoritarian of closed autocracies everywhere. You have to have a veneer. Yeah. A veneer, and that veneer may offer opportunities.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, but you say you'd rather live in a crummy electoral autocracy like Nayib Bukele's than to live in China.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Yes, I am from Thailand, and I'm very. I think the way that you raised Thailand as an example of the decline of democracy. I work on the youth movement in Thailand and the election. I have a question that when we explain the failure of this boom of the mass movement in different countries amidst this decline, the explanation is all about the external condition that you have explained earlier. Is there any other explanation between that external condition, like the decline of the U.S., increased power of China, blah, blah, blah? Is there any other explanation to explain people inside this a democratic country, which in the reality, besides an authoritarian, competitive authoritarian, how can we explain this the increase in demand of democracy in so many countries among people ordinarily?
How do we explain the increase in demand for democracy?
Even though the explanation that you try to do all these statistics, that the increase of competitive authority.
It sounds like you're saying there isn't an increase in demand. In a lot of places, there's a loss of confidence in democracy.
So I think your question is about the increase in demand for democracy in countries that are not democracies, right? And the answer to that is pretty simple. There are a lot more countries in the world that are not democracies now than 20 years ago. And so, you know, and people have more experience of authoritarian regression, authoritarian persistence, authoritarian failure. And to me, I don't need to explain why people in Zimbabwe, people in Venezuela, people in Thailand in a certain way, obviously peacefully through the electoral process, people in Myanmar now through a violent insurgency, and so many others are mobilizing for, seeking to get to democracy because it seems like a natural reaction, first of all, to long established aspirations for democracy, which we can see from the Asian barometer have been long established in Thailand, which we saw a lot of evidence from in Myanmar in the Asian barometer, but also from the manifest failures of authoritarianism. I mean, just look at what Mugabe and his successor have done to the economy in Zimbabwe, what Chavez and his successor Maduro have done to the economy in Venezuela, with 7 million people, a quarter of the population now having fled, and so on. I mean, it's just, and there are many other instances. So even if people were willing to kind of give autocracy a chance, they just looked at the empirical results and the levels of repression and said, we don't want that. I think there's still a lot of popular grassroots demand for democracy. And we see it in the mobilizations, looking at the woman freedom movement in Iran and the extraordinary mobilization there, but they just didn't have the
sign of the new round of.
I think it could be, but what's disheartening to me is that these movements were succeeding in a previous era in many instances, not all, obviously not in China in 1989, but they're generally not succeeding now. And, you know, maybe they will again.
Let's take some more questions over here.
Here, thank you. I might have missed it, but it was an essential part of the title of your talk that I don't see.
Okay.
How do we reverse it? How do we reverse this?
Okay.
This trend. And additionally, I found it interesting that you separated electoral democracies and liberal democracies. But I wonder if it's in the same way. Does it make sense to call these countries that have de facto dictators that simply mimic electoral and democratic procedures in a theatrical way? Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to call them democracies, even if electoral democracies? And if this doesn't help them in the creation and in the feeding of their narratives, I'm sure that differentiates from country to country. In China, I suppose they don't care that much about the perception that they're not a democracy. But speaking from Latin America, I think it does make a lot of sense to call a country that has given up on democracy of a dictatorship and not a democracy anymore, even if an electoral democracy.
So you know what the first order of the Hippocratic Oath is, don't you?
Do no harm.
First, do no harm. I would really like to see the US and the European Union doing some of the other things I suggest, but at a minimum, could they at least do no harm? And I really strongly agree with the presumption or hypothesis of your question, that when you label an authoritarian regime a democracy, or allow it to retain the label that they have trashed, it does harm to the future prospects for democracy in that country and also around the world. That is why I am so angry about the reception that Modi was given in Washington, D.C. Now, look, I'm worried about China's expanding military and sharp power around the world. I think we need India as a strategic interlocutor or partner in the Quad and other things. But you don't have to give this man a place of honor for his desecration of democratic values and human rights in India. And you don't have to call it a democracy. It reminds me, this also made me so angry when George Herbert Walker Bush, as Vice President of the United States in around 1985, not long before Marcos fell from power, went to, or it might have been a little earlier, went to Manila and said to Marcos, "We love your wonderful democracy." Those were his exact words. I'll never forget them. And I mean, come on. Okay, you think Marcos is a strategic partner? Sometimes, we can debate that, right? We can go over to the Belfer Center and debate who we should have strategic partnerships with. But you don't have to call these regimes democracies, and it does a lot of damage when you do so. So the answers to your question here are, in these other slides, which could be made available. Early intervention, I think, is very important, and even preemptive intervention. It is now clear, I think, from the reporting that the Biden administration went down to Brazil, engaged the generals of Brazil, and said there will be really major consequences for the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the United States and our bilateral defense relations if Bolsonaro tries to steal the election and you support him in this. That was preemptive, and it was apparently influential. And you can see these other things which are really kind of summarizing what we've learned from these articles in the Journal of Democracy. And from the experience, some of this is from Laura Gamboa's article, some from Ginsburg and Huck in the Journal of Democracy, some from what I've observed. But, this can be done. And this is the playbook, which I think worked in Greece and worked in Poland. And I'll just say, could work even in much larger and richer advanced industrial democracies, maybe even the largest and richest of them all. Okay, should we take another question?
I have one over here. Yes.
You distinguish between liberal democracies and electoral democracy. Classified India and the undemocratic box right now. Do you believe the elections in India are fair? Are they rigged? Modi may genuinely be a popular leader. If he's elected, why would, through a democratic process, why would you put him in India into an undemocratic box? I can understand an illiberal democracy, but it still remains an electoral democracy.
Good. That's an excellent question. I'm really glad you asked it. So from what I know, when the elections are held in India, and this is kind of the latest assessment I can glean, and they're due by sometime in late May, when the parliamentary term runs out, the votes will be counted honestly on election day. And I do not anticipate and do not know of a major development that would prevent Indians or large numbers of Indians because of their class or status from voting, although there is growing intimidation both against Muslim Indians and lower caste or Dalit Indians that I worry about. But that is not the beginning and the end of democracy. The votes were counted honestly on election day in Hungary. That doesn't make Hungary an electoral democracy. And if you don't look at the surrounding context of the playing field, and this is really superbly described in the early pages of Steve Levitsky and Lucan Wei's book on competitive authoritarianism. And I think, if I may say so, very much further well elucidated by Euclid and Svensson in an early article in the Journal of Democracy, maybe 27 years ago, What Makes for Free and Fair Elections. And the point is what Dahl said in Polyarchy, that the surrounding context of freedom, it doesn't have to be a purely liberal democracy, right? You can have some serious human rights problems, a lot of corruption, some abridgments of civil liberties, and it can just be what you called an illiberal democracy. But when you get to the point where the justice and the prosecution authority have been weaponized, when the tax authorities have been weaponized to intimidate critics from articulating their views, when the media have been turned into lapdogs of the ruling party, except for kind of tiny crevices of independence without much reach, which is why they're tolerated. But really challenging articles about the performance of the incumbent government, the nature of the political system are not being published out of fear and the fairly confident knowledge of negative consequences if they do publish them. When the business community is being relentlessly made to understand that they better get with the program, and if this is what happened in Turkey, if you don't support the ruling party, the tax man will be at your door. And if you do, you know, lots is possible. Or in the famous words of the Brazilian dictator in the 1930s and 40s, this is the mantra of competitive autocrats: for my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law. And that may look like a rule of law state, or it may look on the surface like an electoral democracy, but it's not a rule of law state, it's a rule by law state where the law is being weaponized for authoritarian purposes. Now, all I can say is, and there's no question in my mind, the polls show it, Modi is an extremely popular figure in India today. If there were a presidential election, he would win it against all comers. There's going to be a parliamentary election under even the most democratic circumstances. I think he would win it against all comers. The test of a democracy is not in Turkey, not in Hungary, not in El Salvador today, and not in India, whether the person who is elected is the preference of the majority of the country, but whether there's a level enough playing field and a free enough political environment so we can come to that determination, you know, reasonably confidently.
We'll take one more question. Why don't we go there?
Thank you so much, Professor Larry. I wonder if you have probably studied which countries are in each, or closer to each of the causes of the decline of democracy. And there is some classification maybe of which countries classify more into some cause than other. Maybe to understand the differences in context, what is driving this declining in different countries, in different regions. There are global factors, but there must be sort of contextual factors too. That's one thing. And the second thing is, from my perspective, I come from Colombia. I'm glad to see the improvement of Colombia. But at the same time, there are also two different problems. One is the sort of the structural deterioration of the political climate and guarantees, but also it's simply tough. Even if you have competitive elections, it's simply tough to win against this very popular, liberal rhetoric, narrow. So how to address the fact that you have to be elected within this context, even you have let's suppose you're not being threatened, and you have very, basically fair security conditions to run. But it's really hard to run. It's hard to run, it's hard to win against this rhetoric and narrative. So what do you, see about that?
So the second is a really good and challenging question. And I think one thing it speaks to is the possibility that sociologically, if I can put it this way, we've entered a new global context for democracy, that because of social media and the way people are processing and getting information, and some of the natural drivers of polarization, it's just a different environment, and one much more conducive to populism, and perhaps less conducive, and this isn't the only reason, to, the democracy, party democracy, as we understood it, multi-party democracy, in the first half or the first multiple decades of the 20th century and maybe the late 19th century. Political parties are decaying all over the world. Now, some new ones are rising. Maybe that's just a natural ecological phenomenon, but that's something to be aware of. And then if you see populists rising up, again, I will repeat, even in, as I think now, mature, robust, and liberal a democracy as Taiwan, although the former mayor of Taiwan, Ko Wen-je, is not exactly an illiberal populist, but this man said some pretty outrageously sexist things in the last number of years, and somehow for a very liberal and pro women's equality society, it didn't stop 25% of the people, disproportionately young people, probably disproportionately socially liberal young people, from supporting them. So something's going on. And I refer you back to this slide that when you have a populist or a leader with populist and illiberal tendencies, I think these are some of the necessary responses. But believe me, I realize this is only a partial list. And I will say as well that I'm worried about your current president. I think that he also has illiberal tendencies. And, just because we thought Sri Lanka had come back, right? That was one of the success stories in Ginsburg and Huck's article. And, countries can oscillate back and forth in this space over a long period of time. I think your first question was asking me to explain more of the countries that fall into each box. Is that right?
Sort of group countries by cause.
By cause.
By cause?
Yeah.
By cause of decline.
There are certain family resemblances.
So that would take more time than I have now, okay? But I think there are some countries where the decline of democracy is very performance-driven. And it has to do with you can take certain countries, and now Latin America rises on this list, where the decline of public order, rule of law, social peace, social safety is just a major factor. Look, the reason why Bukele won and then won re-election in a landslide is because the criminal gangs had taken over life in El Salvador. And, he did something about it. Now, he did it in an authoritarian way, and I have to believe that there could have been a different way, but he's wildly popular because he did it. You had in Colombia problems of, insurgent and criminal violence, narco trafficking and whatever. And then I guess President Uribe made progress on that front. And that maybe led him to inflate his ego and think he should remain there indefinitely, and you kind of narrowly averted that. But the crisis of South African democracy now, I don't know if you agree that it's a crisis, is to my mind very performance driven. And so I really realize we're over time. I'm going to end with this sentence. I argued in a book 25 years ago, something that I think is still true. I was inspired by the language, our favorite language from O'Donnell and Schmitter. There's no transition that doesn't begin with a split in the ruling elite, which is, I think, not literally true, but, metaphorically, it's pretty persuasive. And I'd say there's no democratic breakdown in which political corruption is not an important driving factor. And that is not a trivial statement because, there's corruption everywhere, but when corruption is relatively low, democracies are not in trouble. And, somewhere along the line between Nelson Mandela and now, the ANC descended into a feeding frenzy of corruption. And this is a major reason They're not performing, they're not delivering, it wasn't inevitable, and it's a major reason why an illiberal left-wing populist, Julius Malema, I think is going to make shocking gains in the South African election. And then the ANC may have to go into coalition with them, and then it's going to be even uglier, and so on and so forth. So there's another class of countries where crime, economic stagnation, corruption, some mix of those, and performance is bad. That's not the only factor. You get violent conflict, you get insurgency. We've got to understand, I think, in a somewhat different context, the belt of coups in West Africa. But there again, these governments as well were very corrupt, and it's one reason why they've had relative lack of success in confronting insurgency. Anyway, thank you, Tarek. I'm sorry to have gone on so long.